Yes, hello. In this video, I'm going to attempt to explain how a pyramid actually transmits into the hyperdimensions, how it's even possible, why it happens, why it's set up, and why certain abilities are hidden from us unless they are tuned into. As in, there are certain modes of what we would call physics which are actually hidden from us. The only way to access them is if you speak that language. It's a completely different subset of languages in which you can communicate through the hyperdimensions, but they only reveal themselves if you understand the precise mathematical language of them in order to be able to manipulate the laws, the subset of laws, i.e. communicate in this case. I'm going to visually illustrate the main pyramid does multiple things, obviously, but the main property of how a pyramid transmits, this is just a plastic replica. I build them all the time. They are for intuitive purposes because the way I extract data is a two-part process. It's the marriage between intuition and mathematics and logic. So everything has to add up. Otherwise, I don't do it, or I know that there's something wrong. But yes, this is a plastic pyramid, so it's of a higher electron configuration in the neon. So it's not really useful for making pyramids, which for the applications that I'm looking at. But a pyramid does, let's cover in this video just the two main things a pyramid does is it accumulates energy because the geometric stresses set up. It will pull energy into the center of mass, center of gravity, which is a third from the bottom, 2/3 from the top. But also as a result, if you have a pyramid made of a dense material like a metal or something like that, it sets up a stress between the apex and that harmonic third here. It creates an invisible, almost like string of stress. And the way that pyramids can be used to transmit a signal out is to oscillate this point here, which in fact is creating a pressure fluctuation here, or an analog to that would be like the vibrating string of a guitar, in which it is vibrating through this section, and its properties are governed by this length and other factors. The length of this string must be the exact equivalent to the angle, which is an extraction of the baseline units. They must be married. So that is two properties which must align, but there are many more to get a pyramid functioning correctly, you must line them all up in order to communicate with the hyperdimensions. Otherwise, you're only going to get residual bleed-through effects, which are not really of value to me. Some people would find them valuable, but I'm aiming for something else. So a pyramid on its own will create an effect, but it's weak. It's a bleed-through effect. It's a leakage unless it's tuned. If it's fully tuned, then obviously there's going to be miraculous miracles take place. But yes, so the stress is between here and here as your potential medium to transmit to the hyperdimensions, and it's not transmitting out somewhere else. It's transmitting just within this space, which is directly coupled to that place, so you don't need to transmit out. But in saying that, fully functioning pyramid has waves coming out of it as a side effect for other reasons. So yes, an accumulator at the void, or the center of mass, center of gravity, and also taking advantage of the fact that it sets up stress between this point and this point, which is your wavelength octave, and it is directly proportionate to the angle of the system. This is the Nordic system, so it's the systems of 7. This angle, the easiest way to express this angle is quite simply 360 degrees being the 1 divided by 7. That's all it is. This is 1/7 of a circle. So basically, coming over, this is an attempt to try and explain why we can't get to the hyperdimensions unless you have the understanding of the math, so you can have all the baselines as 1 and line them up. So these are all units. This is angle, frequency, wavelength, pressure, cavity wavelength. Oh, this one, I should say density / pressure. It's the same thing. Density translates to pressure eventually in the machine. Cavity wavelength, so in phase for a wavelength. Magnetic polar geometry to create the magnetic void. The gas for the carrier wave is required. And M, so that's mass. But I don't need to put that there because that's, again, part of pressure, mass, pressure, and density. So in reality, everything's kind of randomized when it comes to hyperdimensions. Like, you take anything like the density of this, the composition of gases in the air, the density of this metal here, its geometry, it's all random, and so nothing much is going to happen anywhere or anything. The probability's exceedingly low that everything would be lined up, not to mention you need to create a space, a specific geometric space. I mean, planets do this. Planets do function as devices because of their mass and the center of mass, and so they all have their own individual signatures, so to speak. And they do have a singularity equivalent to a singularity in their center. Not like quite like a black hole, but there is a singular point, and where very interesting effects take place. But basically, so all of these, the easiest way to understand it is like a radio, but it's a geometric radio, and we're not transmitting here, we're transmitting to the hyperdimensions, which I've just called 4D. It could be anything, but just an extra dimension, let's say. And all of these values are just, this is like taking examples from just randomness. So like the angle is here. So if there's like, it's like, imagine it like a laser beam. It's starting here, it's shooting off here, and then it's going to bump into this because it's not the same value. Or if you go from here, it's just going to shoot over here. You know, somebody might try and shoot something metaphorically from this angle and it will make its way down here, but it's not going anywhere. It's going out of range. It's not going anywhere or doing anything. So it's, you know, these two are lined up, for example. So like by coincidence, a few might be lined up, but the beam is not going to traverse the next system because it's out of alignment. So that's why you must know exactly the values to break out of this dimension. And I'm only talking in respect to pressure here, so it's not like I'm creating a porthole to send like something crazy through, but to send a pressure fluctuation to the hyperdimensions is the goal. And all of these values must be lined up. So you must understand the baseline units, which are Planck units. Planck angle, which doesn't exist, but it does. It's simple. It's just a circle, 360 degrees, or divisions of. Planck frequency, Planck length, Planck density, and these are sort of secondary, getting onto secondary systems, which must accommodate here. But also the Planck lengths, and I'll keep repeating this, are all calculated using h, not a reduced constant, because a reduced constant is not a constant. And going to the example of where a system is lined up because the baseline values are actually, in fact, calculated up, and these values are correct as well. They're not random. I haven't just made them up, but I'm giving you an example of one of the systems which I was working on for quite a while. The mantis system, or the green. This is like the equilateral. This is the one of the simplest systems in the universe. It's the triangle. It's a 60-degree triangle, and these are actually its correct values in a mode that actually is within range that can function. So they're not just made up values. So they're all lined up so that the pressure or the beam, metaphorical laser beam we're talking about as an example, can pass through from this dimension and make its way all the way to the hyperdimensions where the pressure can be received in a domain in which there is no distance between things, which is a part of this dimension controls this one. This is its master. We are in a secondary. This comes first and we're here, let's say. And so basically, with the marriage in the application of our physics here and understanding the maths for here, we can make signal or traverse between the two domains, so to speak. But you must understand the values. And as I said, these are all correct. These aren't made up. These are actual values. So starting with angle, like a pyramid angle right here, this is the Planck length, 1, 45 degrees, 2, 90 degrees. An octave, it's all within octave range. 1 and 2, 2, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. It's how it works. So a 60-degree system here is 1.33333, 1/3. 45 times 1.3333 is 60 degrees. So you have a 60 degrees pyramid. Let's say it's made of metal, like copper or something, of course. Just a dense metal, but in this case, yes, they're all made of copper for a specific reason. So yes, the angle of the apex is 60 degrees, as is the base because it's equilateral, so it's very easy to understand. It's an equilibrium system. It's in the middle of the middle, let's say. So yes, your first prerequisite, you've made a pyramid and it has an angle, it happens to be 60 degrees. That's what it is. And how do you marry the wavelength to that? You have to understand what the wavelength equivalent to 60 degrees is, and in the correct octave as well, which has which is to do with the mode in how it operates, which is down here as well. So it all has to line up. But let's say, so you've made a copper pyramid at 60 degrees. The wavelength between the harmonic center and the apex must be the same in octave. The wavelength of this system is 17.5 millimeters. So that's not the distance between here and here, but it must be the same octave. So the actual distance between the harmonic center of the pyramid and the apex works out to be exactly 140 millimeters. So let me just double check that. Yes, 140 millimeters. This multiplied by 4, or I think 17 point. Yes, this multiplied by 4 or 8, sorry, 8 is 140. Works out to be 140. So your wavelength between here and here is 140, but the actual wavelength that is made by these two values is 17.5 millimeters. So that's your actual pyramid wavelength. This is an octave of that. So it's a compatible octave. The 60-degree copper pyramid has a distance of 140 millimeters between the center and the apex, which is an octave of the actual wavelength in the machine, which is 17.5 millimeters. The frequency works out to be 522.7 kilohertz. Again, is the Planck frequency, which is in the same range, but in a different octave, but it is a compatible modality for frequency. So essentially you have your angle your frequency, and your wavelength, which must also match density, which translates to the end, to the very end of it all, it translates to pressure at a certain temperature. And so this is the density for 1/3 of the Planck length, the wavelength for 1/3 of a Planck length, frequency for 1/3 of a Planck length at a specific octave, and angle for 1/3 of a Planck length. So Planck length plus 1/3 equals these values. And so this is the actual pressure in the machine at this temperature, 9,345 microns, which is about 99.9 and 99.8% vacuum, approximately, using this gas, which we'll get to. So one gas, a mono gas system, just one gas equals this. So that is your pressure. That sets up the physical wavelength inside the machine. That's telling it the exact wavelength that you're using. You must have a compatible reflective cavity, like a laser cavity. The waves are bounced from a crystal, which is responsible for this oscillating crystal. They are reflected, and so the cavity wavelength must be, again, an octave of this. It must be in phase as a wave bounces to gain amplitude as a standing wave. So it's practically, this is the reflective cavity in a laser equivalent. This must be compatible. So this is this wavelength times 4 is 70 millimeters. So that's your reflective spherical cavity that's focused on this crystal here, which the crystal is obviously tuned to this exact frequency, 522.7 kilohertz, which is, these have more decimal places, but they're not, they're just rounded slightly, the numbers. Magnetic pressure geometry, there's a magnetic void inside the pyramid, essentially opposing magnetic fields, which also must be focused on the epicenter of two places, being, which I won't get into the second place, but the carrier wave, it must be focused on the carrier wave as well. This is like an influencer, so it's practically focusing wherever the pressure is going to come out of it. It's really pushing it to one area. It's helping it to really pop out at a certain place inside the machine. And the very last part of transmission is a gas. This is the carrier wave gas, which is actually, must be a spectral line, which is close, very close. It can't drift more than a nanometer, more than, 1 nanometer at the most from the specific calculated range. Just so happens that this one's in neon, which has a wavelength of 534.1 nanometers, and that is the strongest, closest line to this system. So basically, this gas is what this wavelength couples to. In a way, I'm not going to explain in this video, but the simple version is that you must create a specific, using this to create a specific velocity to transmit the wave through by scaling the hyperdimensions in order to A, use a carrier wave, but B, have a velocity to be able to transmit this wave at a specific speed in order to obtain this frequency. So the three are married together. This and this creates velocity, but it is octaves, specific set of octaves away from this, which is your carrier. So this wavelength here is exactly 15 octaves away from this one. And so if you divide this to the power of by 2 to the power of 15, you'll get approximately this. So basically, these are the prerequisites, and there are more. These are the main ones that I'm showing here in order to line everything up to make a whole. to get from this dimension to the hyperdimensions, sending pressure. That's all that's required, just an intelligible signal. You must tell the system what you're doing by... These are required. Without these, you don't get the result. There are even more systems that must be compatible. It must be the correct electron configuration. Neon must have a configuration which is on the same line as the crystals in the pyramid, which in this example I'm using boron and lithium, which the carrier crystal in this system, which I'm explaining, of this frequency, is lithium tetraborate. So that's the crystal that is used as a carrier, and specifically what's used is the boron, which is the same electron configuration as neon. With the modulation crystal system is lithium fluoride, and I'll get into that as well later on. But basically you need a carrier and a modulator inside the machine. These are examples of what they can be made of and must be made of, but this is a fairly rare crystal. It's made synthetically, and you must fashion it to a specific frequency because it must be of the same configuration as neon. And this is where you can run into massive trouble if you're out of range. The other thing is it has to be a compatible modality, otherwise obviously it won't work. What does that mean? Basically, the pyramid has modes, and each derivative, each pyramid has a different mode because it has a different wave number, so you must make it work. So that has to actually line up. You have to figure out how it does, or it just won't, or it's out of range, or it's just highly inefficient. Also, all of the obtainable values must be in range. All of these values must be physically possible to achieve. They have to... You can't force them to do anything they don't want to do. If they're out of range, it's impossible to build a machine. Like, they have... All values must be in obtainable range. They must be... Like, for example, this frequency is fine at this wavelength. That temperature is fine. That pressure is achievable. But, like, say, for example, if the range calculated popped out and this line, for example, was in, like, deep ultraviolet, which nothing's... The wave wouldn't be able to transmit through anything to start with. This pressure, this could be like, like millions of times the pressure of the Earth, which is unobtainable in practical measures. Or it could be like the vacuum could be so high, it could be like just unobtainable to achieve. So that has to be in range. This has to be in range. The wavelength can't be too big or too small. It must be just right. It has to match the fundamental speed. The velocity must match the fundamental speed within a crystal, for example. It has to be relatively close. So these two have to be compatible with that, which these two together make a velocity of approximately 9,000, I think roughly 9,100 meters a second. And that's close enough to a quartz crystal. No, it's not that. It's 5,000. It's been a while since I looked at the data, but I think it's a 5 or 9,000 meters a second approximately. And that has to be in the range because the range of the crystal is set. You can't change the velocity of the wave inside a quartz crystal. It's fixed. So it all must marry up, and so you have to find the compatible mode, and if you can't, then you can't achieve... If one of these is out of range, like this could be too big. Like this pyramid might calculate out to being like, kilometers high, or it might calculate out to being like 1 millimeter high. Like it all must marry up, and so you have to find the secret combination. It can take years and years and years and years and years just to find one that works. Not to mention multiple gas configurations where it gets even more complex, which are possible, but there's even more complexity to it. So essentially, these are some of the prerequisites. There's others such as the vortex to create the the pressure inside the machine to actually be able to use as a medium to transmit to the hyperdimensions, which I'm not including in this video. But essentially, this is like the rough gist of how it's possible through the tuning and alignment of different forces to get from this dimension out to a hyperdimension, which obviously is the allotment of this spectra, this place on the spectrum. Think of it exactly as spectral lines of an excited gas. This would be 400 nanometers. This would be the value of 800 nanometers. And right here is of 1/3 is approximately 534.1 nanometers. Think of it as spectral lines on an octave which goes on, starts from the Planck length and goes up. And we've chosen one place to create a hole where everything is lined up. And to visualize it, it's like a laser beam that travels from this point in a straight line, pops out. The gas is like the last gateway, so to speak. Creates, in order to be able to create and receive, to transmit and to receive pressure fluctuations from a hyperdimension in this spectra. And so, yeah, that's the theory. Yes, it's difficult to do, and I'm working on it, but it's the requirement. And the math has to be right, and you have to physically be able to build it, and you have to be able to afford it, and it has to be precise enough. If one of these is wrong, then don't expect much to happen, which is the framework the mindset I'm working to anyway. But yes, point of curiosity for those that might find some value in it.